Chapters 25 to 27 of Tristram Shandy, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bruce Peary. The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy, Gentleman, Volume 2, by Laurence Sterne. Chapter 25. Because, quoth my great-grandmother, repeating the words again, you have little or no nose, sir. "'Sdeath!" cried my great-grandfather, clapping his hand upon his nose. "'Tis not so small as that comes to. 'Tis a full inch longer than my father's. Now my great-grandfather's nose was for all the world like unto the noses of all the men, women, and children whom Pantagruel found dwelling upon the island of Ennison. By the way, if you would know the strange way of getting a kin among so flat-nosed a people, you must read the book. Find it out yourself, you never can. 'Twas shaped, sir, like an ace of clubs. 'Tis a full inch, continued my grandfather, pressing up the ridge of his nose with his finger and thumb, and repeating his assertion. 'Tis a full inch longer, madam, than my father's. You must mean your uncle's, replied my great-grandmother. My great-grandfather was convinced. He untwisted the paper and signed the article. Chapter 26. What an unconscionable jointure, my dear, do we pay out of this small estate of ours, quoth my grandmother to my grandfather. My father, replied my grandfather, had no more nose, my dear, saving the mark, than there is upon the back of my hand. Now, you must know that my great-grandmother outlived my grandfather 12 years, so that my father had the jointure to pay, £150 half yearly, on Michaelmas and Lady Day, during all that time. No man discharged pecuniary obligations with a better grace than my father, and as far as £100 went, he would fling it upon the table, guinea by guinea, with that spirited jerk of an honest welcome, which generous souls, and generous souls only, are able to fling down money. But, as soon as ever he entered upon the odd 50, he generally gave a loud hem, rubbed the side of his nose leisurely with the flat part of his forefinger, inserted his hand cautiously betwixt his head and the caul of his wig, looked at both sides of every guinea as he parted with it, and seldom could get to the end of the £50 without pulling out his handkerchief and wiping his temples. Defend me, gracious heaven, from those persecuting spirits who make no allowances for these workings within us. Never, oh, never may I lay down in their tents, who cannot relax the engine and feel pity for the force of education and the prevalence of opinions long derived from ancestors. For 3 generations at least, this tenet in favour of long noses had gradually been taking root in our family. Tradition was all along on its side, and interest was every half year stepping in to strengthen it. So that the whimsicality of my father's brain was far from having the whole honour of this, as it had of almost all his other strange notions. For in a great measure he might be said to have sucked this in with his mother's milk. He did his part, however. If education planted the mistake, in case it was one, my father watered it and ripened it to perfection. He would often declare, in speaking his thoughts upon the subject, that he did not conceive how the greatest family in England could stand it out against an uninterrupted succession of 6 or 7 short noses. And, for the contrary reason, he would generally add, that it must be one of the greatest problems in civil life, where the same number of long and jolly noses, following one another in a direct line, did not raise and hoist it up into the best vacancies in the kingdom. He would often boast that the Shandy family ranked very high in King Harry the Eighth's time, but owed its rise to no state engine, he would say, but to that only. But that, like other families, he would add, it had felt the turn of the wheel, and had never recovered the blow of my great-grandfather's nose. It was an ace of clubs indeed, he would cry, shaking his head, and as vile a one for an unfortunate family as ever turned up trumps. Fair and softly, gentle reader, where is thy fancy carrying thee? If there is truth in man, by my great-grandfather's nose, I mean the external organ of smelling, or that part of man which stands prominent in his face, and which painters say, in good jolly noses and well-proportioned faces, should comprehend a full third, that is, measured downwards from the setting on of the hair. What a life of it has an author at this pass! Chapter 27. It is a singular blessing that nature has formed the mind of men with the same happy backwardness and renitency against conviction, which is observed in old dogs, of not learning new tricks. What a shuttlecock of a fellow would the greatest philosopher that ever existed be whisked into at once, did he read such books, and observe such facts, and think such thoughts, as would eternally be making him change sides! Now, my father, as I told you last year, detested all this. He picked up an opinion, sir, as a man in a state of nature picks up an apple. It becomes his own, and if he is a man of spirit, he would lose his life rather than give it up. I am aware that Didius, the great civilian, will contest this point, and cry out against me, "Whence comes this man's right to this apple? Ex confesso, he will say, things were in a state of nature. The apple is as much Frank's apple as John's. Pray, Mr. Shandy, what patent has he to show for it? And how did it begin to be his? Was it when he set his heart upon it, or when he gathered it, or when he chewed it, or when he roasted it, or when he peeled, or when he brought it home, or when he digested, or when he— For 'tis plain, sir, if the first picking up of the apple made it not his, that no subsequent act could. Brother Didius, Trebonius will answer. Now Trebonius, the civilian and church lawyer's beard, being 3 inches and a half and 3/8 longer than Didius his beard, I'm glad he takes up the cudgels for me, so I give myself no farther trouble about the answer. Brother Didius, Trebonius will say, it is a decreed case, as you may find it in the fragments of Gregorius and Hermogenes's codes, and in all the codes from Justinian's down to the codes of Louis and Desaux, that the sweat of a man's brows and the exudations of a man's brains are as much a man's own property as the breeches upon his backside, which said exudations, etc., being dropped upon the said apple by the labour of finding it and picking it up, and being moreover indissolubly wasted and as indissolubly annexed, by the picker up to the thing picked up, carried home, roasted, peeled, eaten, digested, and so on, 'tis evident that the gatherer of the apple, in so doing, has mixed up something which was his own with the apple which was not his own, by which means he has acquired a property, or, in other words, the apple is John's apple. By the same learned chain of reasoning, my father stood up for all his opinions. He had spared no pains in picking them up, and the more they lay out of the common way, the better still was his title. No mortal claimed them. They had cost him, moreover, as much labour in cooking and digesting as in the case above, so that they might well and truly be said to be of his own goods and chattels. Accordingly, he held fast by 'em, both by teeth and claws, would fly to whatever he could lay his hands on, and, in a word, would entrench and fortify them round with as many circumvallations and breastworks as my uncle Toby would a citadel. There was one plaguy rub in the way of this, the scarcity of materials to make anything of a defence with, in case of a smart attack, inasmuch as few men of great genius had exercised their parts in writing books upon the subject of great noses. By the trotting of my lean horse, the thing is incredible, and I am quite lost in my understanding, when I am considering what a treasure of precious time and talents together has been wasted upon worse subjects, and how many millions of books in all languages and in all possible types and bindings have been fabricated upon points not half so much tending to the unity and peacemaking of the world. What was to be had, however, he set the greater store by. and though my father would oft times sport with my uncle Toby's library, which, by the by, was ridiculous enough, yet at the very same time he did it, he collected every book and treatise which had been systematically wrote upon noses, with as much care as my honest uncle Toby had done those upon military architecture. 'Tis true, a much less table would have held them, but that was not thy transgression, my dear uncle. Here, but why here rather than in any other part of my story, I am not able to tell. But here it is. My heart stops me to pay to thee, my dear uncle Toby, once for all, the tribute I owe thy goodness. Here let me thrust my chair aside and kneel upon the ground, whilst I am pouring forth the warmest sentiment of love for thee, and veneration for the excellency of thy character, that ever virtue and nature kindled in a nephew's bosom. Peace and comfort rest for evermore upon thy head. Thou enviedst no man's comforts, insultedst no man's opinions, thou blackenedst no man's character, devouredst no man's bread. Gently, with faithful Trim behind thee, didst thou amble round the little circle of thy pleasures, jostling no creature in thy way. For each one's sorrows thou hadst a tear, for each man's need thou hadst a shilling. Whilst I am worth one to pay a weeder, thy path from thy door to thy bowling green shall never be grown up. Whilst there is a rood and a half of land in the Shandy family, thy fortifications, my dear uncle Toby, shall never be demolished. End of chapters 25 to 27.